Saudi Arabia and Canada just held a call that some people are calling a $1 trillion attack on the US dollar. And if that were true, your money, your loans, and your country's leverage would all be touched by it. The claim is simple. Riyadh and Ottawa quietly opened a new path around the dollar for energy trade. But the confirmed facts tell a narrower story. And the gap between the claim and the truth may be even more important than the headline, because this is not just about one phone call. It is about whether America's strongest financial weapon is starting to look less untouchable than it used to. On April 29, 2026, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke by phone. That part is real. Canada's official readout says they discussed the Middle East, Saudi Arabia's role in de-escalation, Canada-Saudi cooperation in energy, agri-food, critical minerals, defense and aerospace, and growing trade and investment ties. Saudi reporting also described the call as a discussion of bilateral relations, cooperation, and regional developments with security and economic effects. That is the verified story. But online, the story grew into something much larger. The viral version says Saudi Arabia and Canada secretly finalized a massive $1 trillion economic framework. It says there is a hidden currency clause buried on page 214 allowing oil, gas, and refined products to be settled outside the US dollar. It says the deal would use a basket of euros, yuan, pounds, and even a new digital settlement token. It says Trump made an urgent 11-minute call to stop it. It says Saudi Arabia refused. It says the dollar index fell, gold jumped, the Federal Reserve warned senators, and other countries are now studying the Saudi-Canadian model as a ready-made plan to weaken the petrodollar. That is the claimed story, and those two versions are not the same. So the real question is not only whether the viral claim is true, the real question is why this claim became believable to so many people so quickly. Because for decades, the United States has had a unique advantage. The world runs much of its trade, debt, oil pricing, and reserves through the US dollar. That gives Washington power that no aircraft carrier can match. It helps keep borrowing costs lower. It gives sanctions more bite. It allows the U.S. government to finance huge deficits with global demand for treasury bonds. And it gives American policy enormous reach far beyond American borders. For American viewers, this affects the price of debt, the strength of the dollar, mortgage rates, imported goods, and Washington's ability to punish rivals without firing a shot. For Canadian viewers, this affects something different, but just as serious. Whether Canada is only a junior partner in a US-led economic system, or whether it can build new relationships with powerful states like Saudi Arabia on energy, minerals, defense, and investment, without being trapped inside Washington's political cycle. And for the rest of the world, this is about something bigger than Canada or Saudi Arabia. It is about whether countries that depend on US markets, US security, and US finance are quietly trying to create more options. That is why this story matters even if the $1 trillion claim is unproven. Because sometimes the rumor reveals the fear. The verified call did not announce a confirmed anti-dollar energy pact. It did not announce a new Saudi-Canadian oil settlement system. It did not announce a Bank of Canada Saudi digital token. It did not confirm a secret page, and it did not confirm that Trump made an emergency 11-minute call to force Riyadh to reverse course. But the verified call did show something real. Saudi Arabia and Canada are talking about energy, critical minerals, defense, aerospace, investment, and regional stability. At a time when the global system is tense, oil politics are sensitive, and the U.S. dollar's role is being debated more openly than it was a decade ago. That alone is not a collapse of the petrodollar, but it is part of a wider pattern. Saudi Arabia is not the isolated oil kingdom it once was. It is trying to diversify its economy, build new industries, attract capital, expand mining, grow technology sectors, and turn itself into a central power in the new global economy. Canada, meanwhile, is looking for ways to strengthen its own sovereignty, diversify trade, secure supply chains, and avoid being fully dependent on one powerful neighbor whose politics can change overnight. That is where Mark Carney enters the story. Carney is not just another politician in this narrative. He is a former central banker. He understands currencies, capital flows, global debt, reserve systems, energy finance, and market confidence. So when a call happens between Carney and Mohammed bin Salman, and that call includes energy and critical minerals, it naturally creates a bigger question. Is Canada simply expanding normal diplomacy, or is Carney trying to position Canada inside the next version of global finance? The confirmed evidence supports the first version. The political imagination jumps to the second. And that is the tension, because the competitor's framing turns Carney into the architect of a monetary revolt. It turns Saudi Arabia into the state that finally cracks the dollar system. It turns Trump into the stunned American leader trying to stop it with a short panic call. It turns one diplomatic readout into a secret financial earthquake. That is powerful storytelling, but powerful storytelling is not the same as proof. And in a story about currencies, proof matters. If Saudi Arabia had truly signed a $1 trillion deal with Canada that changed how energy was settled, that would not be a small side detail. It would be one of the biggest financial stories in the world. It would be covered by Reuters, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, central banks, energy markets, and official government channels. Investors would ask questions immediately. Currency desks would react. Oil traders would look for contract language. Bond markets would price risk. Washington would not be able to hide it for long. But the official Canadian readout says the two leaders discussed partnership in energy, agri-food, critical minerals, defense, and aerospace. It says they welcomed ministerial visits as momentum for trade and investment. It says Carney thanked the Crown Prince for an invitation to visit Saudi Arabia. It does not mention a $1 trillion deal or any currency clause. The Saudi readout also does not confirm the viral claim. It describes regional developments, security, and economic implications, relations between the two countries, and ways to develop cooperation. That does not mean nothing happened. It means the confirmed story is about deepening ties, not a publicly proven dollar-breaking agreement. And that difference is the whole story. Because the danger in this moment is not only misinformation, the danger is that the underlying anxiety is real enough that misinformation can ride on top of it. The US dollar is still the world's leading reserve currency. According to Federal Reserve research, the dollar made up about 58% of disclosed global official foreign reserves in 2024, far ahead of the euro, the yen, the pound, and China's renminbi. That means the dollar is not collapsing overnight. But dominance is not the same as invincibility. The dollar's share of reserves has declined from earlier peaks. More countries are exploring local currency trade. China has pushed yuan settlement in some deals. BRICS countries have talked about alternatives. Central banks have bought more gold. Sanctions have shown the world that dollar access is not just a financial tool, it is political power. So when someone claims Saudi Arabia and Canada are building a non-dollar energy pathway, the claim spreads because it hits a real nerve. People already believe the world is looking for options. They are not wrong about that. They may be wrong about this specific deal. And that is the difference between analysis and fantasy. If you are watching this from the United States, the core issue is simple. America's financial power depends not only on military strength, but on trust. Countries use the dollar because it is liquid, widely accepted, backed by deep markets, and supported by U.S. institutions. But they also keep asking themselves one question: what happens if Washington uses the dollar against us? That question became louder after years of sanctions, trade wars, frozen assets, tariff threats, and political fights over debt ceilings and deficits. For U.S. voters, this is not if global demand for dollars and treasury debt weakens over time, America could face higher borrowing costs. That can filter into mortgages, car loans, credit cards, business financing, and the cost of funding the federal government. It does not happen instantly from one phone call, but if enough countries slowly diversify, the pressure builds. This is why the petrodollar idea carries so much weight. The word petrodollar usually refers to the role of U.S. dollars in oil trade and the recycling of oil revenue back into dollar assets, including U.S. financial markets. But there is also a lot of mythology around it. Analysts have repeatedly warned that the story is more complicated than viral posts suggest, and that there was no simple public rule forcing all Saudi oil to be sold only in dollars forever. That matters, Because if you misunderstand the original system, you will misunderstand what it means to challenge it. The dollar's power did not come from one magic contract. It came from a network: oil markets, U.S. treasuries, military relationships, banking infrastructure, trade invoicing, legal systems, market depth, and habit. That network is hard to replace. But networks can weaken slowly, not from one dramatic announcement, from many smaller choices. A currency swap here, a local currency trade deal there, a gold purchase, a sanctions workaround, a new payment rail, a mineral partnership, a defense relationship outside the usual channels, a Gulf state choosing not to rely on only one superpower, a middle power like Canada trying to reduce exposure to U.S. political shocks. That is why the Canada-Saudi call matters even without the unverified claims. Canada and Saudi Arabia have been rebuilding a relationship that was badly damaged years ago. The two countries restored full diplomatic ties in 2023 after a dispute that began in 2018. And Canada's own country profile describes Saudi Arabia as the Arab world's only G20 member and a valued economic and security partner for Canada and its allies. That history matters because this is not happening in a vacuum. Canada is not just calling Saudi Arabia to be polite. Ottawa is looking at a world where supply chains are being rewritten. Critical minerals are becoming strategic assets. Energy security is back at the center of geopolitics, and middle powers are trying to protect themselves from great power fights. Saudi Arabia is not just taking the call as a courtesy either. Riyadh wants investment, technology, minerals, industrial capacity, and global influence beyond oil. In January 2026, Canada announced a memorandum of understanding with Saudi Arabia on mineral resources aimed at cooperation across critical mineral value chains, trade, investment, knowledge sharing, and sustainable supply chains. That is not a petrodollar collapse, but it is a building block. And in geopolitics, building blocks matter. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media turns every piece of it into a neat headline, the real pattern may already be moving underneath it. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. Now look at why Trump becomes part of this narrative. The competitor's version says Trump made an 11-minute pressure call to Saudi Arabia, demanding that the currency clause be reversed. There is no credible public confirmation in the official reporting I found that such a call happened, that it lasted 11 minutes, or that Mohammed bin Salman rejected a specific U.S. demand over a Saudi-Canadian currency clause. So we have to treat that as unverified. But the reason the claim sounds politically believable to some viewers is because Trump has made tariffs, pressure, leverage, and direct leader-to-leader intervention central to his style. His politics are built around forcing deals, punishing rivals, and demanding loyalty from allies. So when a viral story says Trump tried to stop Saudi Arabia from moving away from the dollar, it fits the public image many people already have of him. That does not make it true, but it explains why the story travels, and it also shows the deeper problem for Washington. If allies and partners believe U.S. policy can swing wildly from one administration to the next, they will hedge. They may still work with America. They may still hold dollars. They may still buy U.S. weapons. They may still invest in U.S. markets, but they will quietly build backup plans. That is what serious countries do. They do not wait for crisis. They prepare before the crisis arrives. For Canada, that lesson is especially painful. Canada is deeply tied to the United States. Its economy, exports, auto sector, energy flows, defense posture, border security, and supply chains are all connected to Washington. But that closeness also creates vulnerability. When the U.S. changes tariffs, Canada feels it. When the U.S. shifts industrial policy, Canada feels it. When Washington starts treating allies like bargaining chips, Canada has to ask how much dependence is too much. That is why Carney's outreach to Saudi Arabia can be framed as part of a broader sovereignty strategy. Not anti-American, not anti-dollar by default, but less dependent. And there is a difference. Canada does not need to destroy the US dollar to strengthen its own position. It needs options. More buyers, more investors, more energy partners, more mineral partnerships, more diplomatic channels, more leverage when it sits across from Washington. That is where Saudi Arabia becomes useful. Saudi Arabia brings capital, it brings energy power, it brings regional influence, it brings a sovereign wealth strategy. It brings relationships across the Gulf, Asia, Africa, and the Muslim world. It also brings controversy, human rights concerns, and strategic risks that Canada cannot ignore. That last part matters. A serious analysis cannot pretend Saudi Arabia is just a clean economic opportunity. Riyadh is powerful, but it is also politically sensitive. Any deeper Canada-Saudi relationship will raise questions about values, defense exports, regional conflict, human rights, and whether Canada is trading moral clarity for strategic flexibility. That is the counterpoint. And it is a real one. But geopolitics is rarely clean. Countries often deal with partners they would rather not depend on because the world forces hard choices. The United States does this, Canada does this, Europe does this, China does this, Saudi Arabia does this. The question is not whether Canada should talk to Saudi Arabia. The question is what Canada wants from the relationship, what it is willing to trade for it, and how much independence it can gain without creating a new dependency somewhere else. For Saudi Arabia, the calculation is also clear. Riyadh wants to avoid being trapped between Washington and Beijing. It wants U.S. security ties, Chinese trade, European investment, and relationships with middle powers like Canada. It wants to sell energy today while building the industries of tomorrow. It wants to be treated as a global power, not just an oil supplier. So when Saudi Arabia talks to Canada about energy, minerals, defense, aerospace, trade, and investment, that fits its long-term diversification strategy. Not every move is a rebellion against the dollar, but every diversification move reduces the idea that Saudi Arabia's future must run only through Washington. That is what makes this story sensitive. Because the U.S. does not need to lose Saudi Arabia completely to feel pressure. It only needs to lose exclusivity. In the old world, Washington could often assume that its partners had no real alternative. In the new world, countries are trying to make sure they have several. That shift is happening across energy, minerals, shipping, semiconductors, defense, food security, digital payments, and currency settlement. And Canada is trying to decide whether it will be a passive country pulled around by larger powers, or an active country building its own network before the next shock hits. That is the real Carney angle. If the viral story says Carney cracked the petrodollar with a secret $1 trillion clause, the verified story says something more grounded, but still important. Carney is engaging Saudi Arabia at the exact points where the future economy is being built. Energy, minerals, defense, aerospace, and investment. Those are not soft topics. Those are power topics. Critical minerals affect electric vehicles, batteries, military systems, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, and national security. Energy affects inflation, transport, food prices, industrial costs, and geopolitical leverage. Defense and aerospace affect security alliances and high-end manufacturing. Trade and investment affect jobs, capital flows, and long-term influence. So even without a confirmed $1 trillion agreement, this call belongs inside a bigger map. Canada wants relevance in a world where resources are becoming strategic again. Saudi Arabia wants partners beyond oil and beyond old alliances. The United States wants to keep the dollar and its alliance system at the center. China wants to slowly build alternatives. Europe wants security without total dependence. And countries in the global south are asking why they should live under a system they did not design. That is the real pressure point. Do you think Canada should build deeper ties with countries like Saudi Arabia to gain leverage? Or does that create risks Canada may regret later? And for American viewers, do you think the U.S. should protect dollar dominance through trust and stability, or through pressure and threats? That debate is not going away. Now let's deal with the market claims. The competitor says the dollar index fell 2.3% and that gold and rival currencies jumped in response to the supposed Saudi-Canada deal. But Reuters reported on April 29th that the dollar strengthened after the Federal Reserve kept rates unchanged, while investors were also watching the conflict involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran. That directly conflicts with the viral claim of an immediate dollar sell-off tied to this alleged pact. That does not prove markets will never worry about de-dollarization. They already do sometimes. but it does mean this specific market reaction should not be presented as confirmed unless credible market data and reporting support it. The competitor also says the Federal Reserve warns senators that wider adoption of this model could raise mortgage rates, auto loan rates, and federal borrowing costs. That is plausible as a general economic theory if dollar demand weakened in a major way over time. But the specific claim of an emergency Fed consultation tied to a Saudi-Canada pact is not verified by the official readouts or the credible reporting available. So the responsible way to say it is this: if major energy exporters and major buyers moved away from dollar settlement at scale, it could reduce some demand for dollars and dollar assets. That could matter for U.S. borrowing costs over time. But there is no confirmed evidence that Canada and Saudi Arabia just created that system in this phone call. That is the line between useful analysis and fake certainty. And fake certainty is dangerous because it makes viewers miss the real story. The real story is not that the dollar died on April 29th. It did not. The real story is that more countries are thinking about a world where the dollar is still powerful, but no longer unquestioned. That is a very different story. It is slower. It is less cinematic. But it may be more important, because global financial power usually does not collapse like a building in a movie. It erodes like a shoreline. One wave does not change the map. But year after year, the edge moves. America still has the deepest financial markets in the world. The dollar is still the main reserve currency. U.S. Treasury markets are still enormous. The dollar is still central to trade, banking, and crisis safety. No rival currency has fully replaced the trust, liquidity, openness, and scale of the dollar system. China's yuan is limited by capital controls and trust issues. The euro has scale, but not one unified fiscal state behind it. Gold is a hedge, not a full payment system. Digital tokens can settle transactions, but they do not automatically create global trust. So anyone saying the dollar has already been broken is overstating the case. But anyone saying the dollar can never be challenged is also ignoring the direction of travel. That is where the Saudi-Canada story becomes a warning signal, not proof of a collapse. A signal of a mood, a signal that countries are exploring new alignments, a signal that energy, minerals, finance, and national strategy are merging, a signal that Canada under Carney may be trying to play a more ambitious role, a signal that Saudi Arabia is not waiting for permission from Washington to diversify its partnerships, and a signal that Trump's pressure-first politics may create the very hedging behavior he wants to prevent. That is the irony. If the United States wants countries to stay inside the dollar-centered order, it has to make that order feel stable, fair, and worth trusting. Threats can force obedience for a while. Trust keeps systems alive for generations. And this is where Trump's role becomes more complicated than the viral story suggests. Maybe there was no 11-minute panic call. Maybe that detail is pure sensationalism. But Trump does not need to make that call for the broader fear to exist. Allies already know how he uses pressure. Markets already know he likes tariffs. Foreign governments already know his loyalty tests can be expensive. So even an unverified story can expose a verified strategic problem. Washington's partners are watching, and they are preparing for uncertainty. For Canada, the lesson is not to abandon the United States. That would be unrealistic and damaging. The U.S. will remain Canada's most important economic and security partner. Geography alone guarantees that. But Canada can no longer behave as if geography is strategy. Being next to the United States is not enough. Canada needs its own industrial plan, energy plan, mineral plan, trade plan, defense plan, and diplomatic plan. If Carney understands anything, it is that power in the modern world flows through systems, capital systems, energy systems, supply chains, payment systems, and trust systems. That is why a call with Saudi Arabia is bigger than a call. It is a piece of positioning. For Saudi Arabia, the same logic applies. Riyadh is not trying to become Canada's junior partner. It is trying to build a network where it can talk to Washington, Beijing, Ottawa, Brussels, New Delhi, and others from a position of strength. That is what sovereign states do when the world becomes unstable. They diversify before they are forced to. Now, should Americans worry? Yes, but not because one unverified Saudi-Canada deal has destroyed the petrodollar. Americans should worry because dollar dominance depends on behavior, not just history. If the U.S. uses sanctions too broadly, threatens allies too often, runs deficits without discipline, politicizes financial trust, or turns every partnership into a loyalty test, more countries will look for ways to reduce exposure, slowly at first, then more openly. And when a system is built on confidence, perception matters. Should Canadians pay attention? Absolutely, because Canada may have an opportunity to become more than a country reacting to U.S. pressure. It can become a serious player in critical minerals, energy security, clean technology supply chains, food exports, defense production, and middle power diplomacy. But that requires discipline. It requires choosing partners carefully. It requires negotiating from strength. And it requires not confusing viral headlines with actual leverage. Canada cannot build sovereignty on fantasy. It has to build it on assets, energy, minerals, ports, talent, capital, rule of law, alliances, technology, defense capacity, diplomatic seriousness. That is the real test for Carney. Not whether he secretly cracked the petrodollar in one phone call, whether he can turn Canada's strengths into bargaining power before the next global shock arrives. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Either the dollar is finished or nothing happened. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story. So here is the clean conclusion. The April 29th Carney Mohammed bin Salman call was real. The official readouts confirm serious discussions on regional security, energy, trade, investment, critical minerals, defense, and aerospace. The viral claim of a confirmed $1 trillion anti-dollar energy pact, a page 214 currency clause, a new digital settlement token, a Fed panic briefing, and Trump's 11-minute reversal call remains unverified. But the reason the story matters is not only whether the viral version is true, it matters because the world is clearly moving toward a more fragmented financial and strategic order. The United States still sits at the center, but more countries are building side doors. Saudi Arabia wants options beyond old oil politics. Canada wants options beyond U.S. dependence. Trump wants leverage, but leverage can push partners to hedge. And Carney, with his financial background, may understand better than most leaders that the next battle for sovereignty will not only be fought with tanks, tariffs, or speeches. It will be fought through currencies, minerals, energy contracts, investment flows, and who controls the systems everyone else has to use. So no, the verified evidence does not show that Canada and Saudi Arabia just broke the petrodollar with a secret $1 trillion deal. But yes, this call points toward a world where even America's closest partners and oldest energy relationships are being re-examined. And the next question is even bigger. If Canada and Saudi Arabia are only one piece of this shift, which country moves next? And what happens when the dollar faces not one challenger, but a network of countries quietly building alternatives? In my next video, I am covering how Trump's pressure tactics may be pushing U.S. allies toward new trade and currency backup plans. And what I found will change how you see this.